When attempting to quantify and qualify the developmental resources and talent needed to create a game like Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, there are quite a few factors to take into account. Probably among the most significant is how well a diverse roster of video game characters, from disparate franchises no less, needs to blend and animate congruously on screen together while still emoting and expressing themselves in ways that are fundamentally representative of the respective series from which they appear. Keeping that in mind then, it is quite remarkable that Super Smash Bros. Ultimate seems to excel so highly in the animation department, particularly in comparison to its predecessors. But before we start looking at some direct comparisons, we need to take a look at some fundamental aspects of animation that will help us establish a standard by which we can evaluate the quality of the animations present in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. For the purposes of this series, we'll be using Disney's 12 Principles of Animation, as described by Disney animators Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas, in their 1981 published guideline for animators titled The Illusion of Life, Disney Animation. This book has been regarded by some traditional animators and computer animators alike as the Bible of animation, and as such, we'll be going over each of Disney's basic principles in the context of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate animations in this episode of Smash Labs. In the interest of expediency, we're going to try not to delve too deeply into the core tenets of animation as described by Johnston and Thomas, but a cursory overview of the basics is essential for understanding any objective and/or subjective evaluations being made over the course of our animation analyses. So let's get right into it. One of the most important animation principles you'll encounter in the domain of fluid and realistic animations in the first of Disney's 12 principles is the concept of squash and stretch, and it can be broadly applied to any object that an animator wishes to animate, whether the object's real-life counterpart be inanimate or not. With this principle alone, you can animate even the most lifeless and primitive of objects, like a box or ball. Take Kirby, for instance. In terms of Smash Bros. Characters, the overall shape of Kirby's character model is by far one of the most simplistic in the entire roster. Without a significant number of articulation points or joints clearly visible in Kirby's silhouette, his shape itself will need to transform dynamically in order to bring life to his animations. After all, the very definition of animate comes from the concept of something being imbued with life or vigor, and that's where squash and stretch comes in. A common theme among some of Disney's animation principles is the artistic approach to interpreting some of the laws of physics from real life, typically those that are visually intuitive enough for most people to follow and grasp. And squash and stretch tends to demonstrate these concepts more clearly than some other principles, since it can be applied with great effect to even the most basic objects. The key components of this principle deal with the flexibility, weight, acceleration, and inertia of an object moving throughout its environment. Some of the other principles take a more granular approach to visually representing these physics concepts. But squash and stretch serves as a very broad approach that can incorporate many of the visual components that some of the other principles define more specifically. Going back to Kirby, for example, his animations heavily rely on squash and stretch, as we can see here where the exaggerated squash of his character model conveys a sense of impact upon landing. This approach is pretty crucial for a character model that doesn't have any joints between its appendages to convey a sense of weight when the character is landing, compared to, say, a character model that has knees that bend when it lands to convey the same information. The important thing to keep in mind with squash and stretch is the preservation of volume of the object being manipulated. So if the object is being stretched vertically, there should be some degree of contraction happening along the horizontal axis. Inversely, if the object is being squashed vertically, we should see some degree of expansion happening along the horizontal axis. In other words, if you squash along one axis, you need to stretch along the other axes, or vice versa. The two concepts go hand in hand. Now up until this point, we've been using Kirby's model to demonstrate squash and stretch, due to the model's simplicity. But squash and stretch isn't just used for simple objects. Even when animating models with more complex armature, the technique can still be pretty useful, depending on what idea you're trying to convey. If you take the same approach of squash and stretch that was used on Kirby's model and apply it to an animation of a character with more humanoid proportions, the animation can become more comedic and whimsical. However, in more realistic scenarios, squash and stretch can simply be used to convey movement typical of humanoid musculature or certain types of clothing. Another useful application of squash and stretch can be found in manipulating shapes of complex objects that would otherwise be inanimate or mechanical. Take Mario's flood, for instance. You can breathe a lot of life into objects like these by simply squashing and stretching them and/or their actions. There are many applications of squash and stretch that are still relevant today, even within the field of computer animation. Nevertheless, this basic principle continues to get most of its mileage out of traditional hand-drawn animation, since traditional animation doesn't utilize a computational physics model and can only convey physics artistically. The main crux of the anticipation principle is to prepare the viewer for a new idea or action, especially actions involving quick motions, so that it isn't too sudden, fleeting, or jarring. Since an animator cannot draw or keyframe an infinite amount of poses, they have to make the most out of the limited number of key poses that will end up being used, which usually consists of just enough frames so that the animation looks fluid to save on production time and resources. With generally fewer poses to realize any given action and motion compared to real life, it can be pretty hard for the audience to follow along without certain visual cues. The following are a few examples of anticipation in Smash Ultimate. In this example, Mario throws a baseball. Notice how the animation used to convey anticipation starts with Mario leaning backwards, shifting all of his weight onto his right leg as his left leg continues to lift off the ground, and twisting his body in preparation of the throw. All of these articulations in Mario's pose tell us that he's going to throw the baseball and he's going to throw it forcefully, which not only helps with the readability of the action, but its believability as well. Here's the same idea of anticipation, except this time it's being applied to a swinging motion instead. In Smash Ultimate, this specific action is very powerful. So in the interest of fairness to other players who could be affected by this action, there's a lot of wind-up in the animation, especially because the characters are relatively small in proportion to the rest of the screen real estate, and thus can be difficult to read. This next example demonstrates anticipation for an action that doesn't involve any objects external to the character model itself, like jumping. The key is in the knees, well, and in the eyes too. As Mario prepares for his jump, he lowers his stance, bends his knees, finds his footing, fixes his gaze upwards, and then takes off. For an action that happens so quickly for the sake of responsiveness, there needs to be as many visual cues as possible in each pose to help indicate what's about to happen, and Mario's anticipation poses are keyframed perfectly here. The staging principle of animation has a lot in common with some of the core tenets of theater presentation. Much like in theater, the placement and framing of anything visible to the audience should be carefully considered so that the artistic intent is always clear to the audience. Nowadays, staging tends to focus on how a character is positioned and contrasted in relation to their environment. In the context of Smash Ultimate, this means that the characters, their actions, and their expressions should be clearly readable, and that there should be as few elements in the scene as possible that could compromise the clarity of the presentation. When we look at Smash Ultimate's presentation during gameplay, the clarity in the staging is remarkably evident. The camera dynamically tracks the action so that it always feels front and center. The Fresnel reflections that outline every character allow the characters to stand out compared to their backgrounds in a way that appears to be organic. And the characters' faces are more visible to the camera compared to the visibility of their faces in the previous Smash games. Aside from the general framing of the stage, Smash Ultimate also utilizes certain visual aids during gameplay to help players and viewers follow along with the action, like directional streaks that appear during attack animations, or the smoke effects that appear when a character is launched. The key to staging in animation lies in finding ways to direct the audience's focus to a specific set of characters, actions, or ideas. Straight ahead and pose to pose deal with the technical method of producing poses for a given animation, which involves either spontaneously drawing poses, one right after the other until the animation is complete, or planning key poses ahead of time to establish a predictable sequence of action, where in-between poses can be filled in or interpolated after the fact. The spontaneous nature of the straight-ahead approach can lead to some very free-flowing and wild animations, which is great for creativity, but it can be pretty hard to work with when you're trying to animate a character whose proportions need to be consistent from frame to frame. With the pose-to-pose approach, an animator can make more consistent and predictable animations, but those animations might not be as captivating to watch as animations drawn under the straight-ahead approach. In the field of computer-generated 3D animation, the pose-to-pose approach is more common than the straight-ahead approach, due to the fact that the interpolation between keyframes for each pose can be completely automated. In games like Smash Ultimate, the poses for character animations are mapped out based on the minimum amount of key poses needed to convey a specific action or idea, and then intermediate frames of animation are generated either automatically or manually in order to fluidly animate from one key pose to the next. This method often allows for animation sequences that are easy to follow and clearly communicates a sequence of actions or ideas. The follow-through and overlapping action animation principle primarily deals with the artistic application of physics from the real world. The concept of follow-through in animation is a bit like the opposite of the anticipation principle. Where anticipation can help prepare the audience for an action, follow-through conveys the termination of an action more realistically to the audience, since actions in the real world initiated by objects with loosely connected parts don't normally come to a sudden stop all at once. For overlapping action, different parts of an object or objects that are loosely connected will move at different rates, which can result in certain parts of an object or objects lagging behind other parts during certain actions. Specifically, the parts of an object that move at slower rates than other parts when an action has been initiated or terminated is often described as having drag. Here are a few examples of follow-through, facilitated by the use of overlapping action. As Dr. Mario enters the landing phase of this up smash animation sequence, his feet partially terminate the action, but his torso, all of his appendages, his head, and even his stethoscope continue moving after he has landed in order to indicate the force and impact associated with this action. Similarly, we can see how powerful Dr. Mario's forward air attack really is by the fact that his body continues to move along the same path of motion that was initiated by the main action, long after the main action has ended. Probably one of the clearest examples of follow-through and overlapping action is when Dr. Mario attempts to suddenly stop moving after initiating a dash. The movements we can see in Dr. Mario's lab coat, stethoscope, and limbs are considered follow-through and are indirect results of the dash animation suddenly coming to an end. The overlapping action here is evident as well, as we see different parts of Dr. Mario's model moving at different rates. Bottom line for this principle, if you're an aspiring animator and you want your characters to move naturally and realistically, applying the principle of follow-through and overlapping animation is a must. Slow in, slow out is based on the general observation that most moving objects in real life take some time to get going and also take some time to stop moving. In the field of animation, acceleration and deceleration of moving objects can be realized by drawing or keyframing more poses at the beginning and end of an action and less poses in the middle of an action. The spacing between different poses is critically important because the farther away multiple frames are from each other, the faster the action will appear to happen. Likewise, the closer multiple frames are to each other, the slower the action will appear to happen. Based on these concepts, an animator can create the illusion of acceleration and deceleration of various actions. Here are a few examples. As Mario pulls out his cape, notice how these initial frames of animation are not only numerous, but also close together. There isn't much space between them. This is done in part to give the impression that the action is building momentum, which tells the audience that they should anticipate the action is going to accelerate. As the animation progresses, the frames become more spread out, giving the impression of acceleration. Once the animation reaches a critical point where the action can be perceived as terminating, the frames start to get closer and closer together again, and there are a lot more of them than there were during the middle of the action, which is done in part to convey the action of decelerating. In essence, this is the general purpose of the slow in, slow out principle. Now sometimes animators might break the slow in, slow out rule because they're going for a certain effect that might be hindered by this rule. Or in the case of video game animators, there simply may not be enough time to allot for more frames than what's necessary due to an action requiring immediate responsiveness. Take Mario's jab attack animation for instance. It's lightning fast and literally comes out in 2 frames. The first frame gives just a hint of anticipation, and the next frame, spaced much farther apart than the first, lands the attack. This approach to animation is a bit of an exception to Mario's moveset, so it stands in contrast to his other actions as being an especially quick action, which is acceptable when such an action is used sparingly compared to the rest of Mario's animation approaches. All in all, there are quite a few ways to apply the slow in, slow out principle, and Smash Ultimate seems to be getting plenty of mileage out of it. While the arc's animation principle is marked 7th on the list, that doesn't necessarily mean that it should be any less important than the other principles. So why are arcs important? Well, probably because, with the exception of mechanical objects, most things in nature tend to move with arcing motions. Gravity plays a big part in that, but in terms of biomechanics for moving entities like humans, many of our movements are based on rotations around pivot points, like joints. It's simply a part of our anatomy, and the anatomy of other creatures as well. In a video game like Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, these arcs can be as subtle as idle animations that slightly move the character's limbs, head, and even eyes around, or the arcs can be used for impactful and dramatic movements like smash attacks. Whatever the case, unless an animation is intended to be robotic, it should typically move in arcs in order to increase the believability and realism of the animation. Secondary action is an animation principle that I believe to be particularly notable regarding the character animations in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Its purpose is to support or reinforce the main action in order to increase its believability and or add a bit more flair to the action and or character. It is with this principle that you'll see a lot of animators take creative liberties to really help make the actions of a character feel distinct and expressive. But it should be noted that secondary actions shouldn't be so noticeable that they start to detract from the main action. Nevertheless, when used with some restraint, it could yield some fantastic results. Let's look at a few examples. One of the key ideas we can glean from Mario's idle animation here is just how much of a spring in his step he appears to have, which I guess makes sense when you consider the fact that he's known for jumping on things. And it's pretty amazing that his animation can convey all of this when the action primarily consists of him stepping in place. However, there are also individual secondary elements that come together to make this happen. Outside of his knees popping as his feet move up and down, his hands and arms rhythmically swing up and down as well. These upper body movements are considered secondary because they cannot convey the main action on their own, but they nevertheless support the main action. Some secondary actions are designed to merely add dimension and personality to the character performing an action, like we can see here as Mario adjusts his hat, or when Mario blinks with an impressively fluid looking 8 frames of eyelid animation. Something else you may have noticed while looking at Mario's idle animation is his occasional bob and weave. This animation actually ties into one of the animation principles we'll be covering later in this episode, but suffice to say that it helps to add even more personality and expressiveness to Mario's character, as idle animations tend to do, in order to keep the player's character feeling alive, even when the player is no longer directly controlling the character. Another good example of secondary action can be seen when the characters teeter on the edge of a stage or platform. For Mario's animation, we can see as his whole body moves in an unstable pattern to convey the idea that he's trying to balance himself, but this action is also accented by the posturing of his open mouth. However, that's not the only notable secondary action here. If we look closely, we can also see that Mario's irises and pupils dilate and constrict at certain points in order to really sell the idea that Mario is having an actual emotional and physiological reaction to nearly falling off of a ledge. Pretty impressive. In one of my favorite examples, there's a pretty cool secondary detail that occurs at the end of Mario's fiery side smash animation. Note how, as this fiery attack comes to an end and Mario starts to return to his default position, we can see him fanning his hand in an attempt to dissipate the heat that it just produced. While we can technically classify this as a separate action, it still isn't the focus of Mario's animation at this point, and was simply included to add more dimension to the follow-through of the